But thanks so much for joining us. My name is Gino. I'm with the Purpose Driven Podcast. I'm here with a really, really good friend of mine, Alex. We've actually got to know each other quite a bit. Lena asked me yesterday, she's like, how long have you known Alex? I'm like, man, I don't know. It probably hasn't been very long, maybe like 3 or 4 years since we've started coming to Church of Truth together. So it hasn't been, I mean, I know like in crossing and, with family and stuff like that.
Feels like longer.
But it does feel longer. And I think that's just based off of the relationships we've built. And just like we talked again this morning, you're only going to get so much of the Father's heart when you open yourself up to it, right? When you become vulnerable, when you share, and then you have those heart-to-heart conversations. And I feel like we've built that up in the last couple of years. Mm-hmm. But man, I'm excited to have you. I've got, not to diminish the value of the other guys in our church that speak, but I think that the way that you deliver, the way that you break down certain theologies in how I view things is very beautiful. And it's an honor to have you here with me. Share a little bit about yourself, share a little about your family. I know you got a little one on the way. Kind of what prompted these particular conversations with yourself, where it led you, where you're at now, and we'll just kind of go from there.
Yeah. Well, I love what you're doing here, and it's honestly an honor to be a part of it. So thanks for inviting me in.
It's cool, man. Good to have you.
Yeah, me personally. My name's Alex. My wife's name is Christina. We have a 3-year-old named Ezekiel, and another baby girl on the way at the end of October. And for me, I grew up in a Christian household. It was more conservative, kind of like the Slavic Christian household. Mm-hmm. And I started having questions. I think it was my first year of community college, when I was talking to some people, and they brought up the idea of evil and why they're not believers in a God, because it was the existence of evil in the world. Eventually, these questions weren't answered very well by my Christian acquaintances and friends and leaders. And usually it was either dismissed or I was kind of looked at weird.
Yeah.
And years later, it actually evolved into a skepticism. So
you personally?
Yeah, me personally. So what happened was I ended up, having a phase like most young people do that's away from God. And then I had a born again experience. I got saved. I got baptized with the Holy Spirit, all of that. And after that is where the harder thoughts, harder questions started to set in. And it was after that experience that I actually eventually, this is a long process, I'm shortening the whole thing, but eventually came to a conclusion where personally, philosophically speaking, I was a naturalistic skeptic. So what that means is I believed that there is probably no God, and everything that we know, feel, or experience can be explained through natural phenomena. There's no need for anything supernatural. Everything from the love you feel for the people to the anger you feel is chemical. Everything from how the world got here to why photosynthesis works is purely chemical, biological, and physical. And so that was kind of my position.
How did you get there? What made you believe that?
It was quite a long process, but it started with doubts that weren't answered very well. And when you have doubts and you're not voicing them to people who, as Jude tells us in Scripture, that are merciful to you and you're doubting, you kind of tend to go to people who will help explain things. And so I started listening and reading a bunch of atheists, and there was a whole movement of new atheism in the United States, and that kind of caught me off guard a little bit. And so eventually, after not finding the answers that I thought were satisfactory, I'm like, Christianity is just not for smart people. Like, this is just something that they believe because they were taught it, just like every other world religion out there. And so that's kind of where I landed. In that state, though, I realized this later. In that state, though, God never left me because I was already His. And so His arms were always open. And so what happened was I encountered, and by the way, Christine and I were already engaged at this time. And I was trying to keep it a secret from her. Oh, really? And she was in missionary school, and she sensed something was up. So she started praying for me because of the way
you're engaged to a girl while you're
who was about to
borderline atheist.
Yeah, who was about to go on a mission trip to India.
Yeah.
And and my position was basically there's most likely no God. There's a small chance, but it's very unlikely. And so in that state, obviously with prayers, I ran across some Blaise Pascal, which is he was a very brilliant philosopher, and a guy named C.S. Lewis that many of us have heard of. And I encountered this idea of looking at things where I'm like, okay, this is the biggest possible question anybody can ask hands down, because it actually affects a potential eternity if it exists.
Yep.
And so I'm like, okay, if I'm going to live the rest of my life as if God doesn't exist, and it wasn't like sin that I was struggling with. I can honestly say it was literally just I just couldn't come to terms intellectually with God being real. And I'm like, okay, I better be pretty darn sure that he's not there, because I do want to have kids one day, and I want to be able to teach them the truth, because truth matters.
Yep.
And so that started me on my journey of seeking after God. Little did I know the Holy Spirit was involved in all the details that came together later. No time for that now. But at the end of the day, I came to the conclusion where I was saying, God, it is most likely that you exist. And if you do exist, you have to be Jesus of Nazareth, because I went through the world religions and I was prepared, man. I was like, if Mormonism is true, I'm going to be a Mormon. Islam for a little bit seemed convincing to me. And so eventually I'm like, Jesus is the only one that would actually historically answer the questions. And I'm like, I'm prepared to live the rest of my life as if you're there, but I would love to actually know.
Yeah.
And I was praying this to God in a huge, like, Pentecostal style prayer conference type of thing in a church. And I grew up in the church. I know how to, I know what to do to fit in. I look over and there's a guy who both of us know, by the way. I didn't know who he was back then. He was across the room. It's loud. He was across the room. And I prayed to God for, I think, 3 or 4 pretty specific things, and then asked for him to reveal himself to me. And he looks at me and I'm like, what's happened? And so I'm like, okay, whatever. I blend back in,
Blend back in.
Yeah, there's a chameleon. there's a tap on my shoulder, and I look down and it's him, and he's like, hey, what's your name, man? I'm like, Alex. Is it okay if I pray for you? I'm like, sure. He starts praying for me, and then somehow starts listing the things that were between me and God, and then says, God, I just ask that you would reveal yourself to him. Bro, before that happened, I was at a place where I intellectually came to the conclusion through research and study that Jesus is the most likely possibility for a God. After that prayer, something felt like physically came over my body. I started weeping, so I had to get out of there because and that was like God saying, "Welcome home," because it was almost like the spirit allowed me to do certain things and helped guide me back home, so that I can realize. One of the reasons, I think, is so I can realize that Christianity actually does have the best intellectual questions for reality.
Yeah.
And so I've been serving the Lord ever since. I've pursued all sorts of things that I can in terms of bettering my knowledge. I'm currently working on finishing up a bachelor's in Bible and theology at Multnomah University. Working on finishing up a certificate of apologetics from Biola University, and God willing, I would love to go on to get a master's and maybe beyond. But that's for the next episode. I'm gonna back up, because you said I was studying so much that I came to the conclusion that if it's in Mormonism, I'm gonna be a Mormon. If it's in Christianity, I'm gonna be a Christianity. Is it safe to say that all of us, whether we believe it, whether we're skeptics, whether most as a believer, I feel like this is what our identity is built on. But every one of us is seeking to worship something, to pursue something, to feel something in our life that we believe is the truth. I think that's a really, really fair question. I think it's really interesting to go into that. So there's something called sensus divinitatis. It's like Latin for this. It's been researched. It's this feeling within someone for something greater than themselves. I think the Christian answer actually helps answer that as well, because according to the Christian answer, we actually do need God to be fully ourselves. And so as we pursue God and he renews us and we get born again, we actually become more fully who he created us to be. And so I think people of other worldviews, religions or non-religions, they're kind of pursuing the same thing.
Yeah.
And I think Paul in Romans 1 says something about this when he talks about that nature itself testifies of God. And so there's a lot of work done behind this question. It's a really deep one, and I think it's true.
Yeah. And I think you got the pursuit of the Creator, because he's created you, right? So you're looking to fill that void. And I also have been thinking about this recently is you have the pursuit, and then you also have the worship. Whether we tend to worship, and like some people say, well, I'm not a preacher. Well, we all tend to be preachers of something, right? Whether you believe it or not, you're preaching what you worship, right? Yeah. And if you back it up, it's like we're all worshiping something. We may not know it. I may be worshiping my career. I may be worshiping a basketball team, a particular celebrity. We all seek something. We're all after something. And then when we place our identity into it, that becomes our worship. And naturally, that's what we fill ourselves with, right? And I think that's what, as a human nature, we're constantly looking for that. And that's where you have the deviation from worshiping the Creator, who's, as a father, is reaching out to pull you in. And we tend to fill it with kind of the worldly stuff and the vanity things.
Yeah, we continue to be restless. St. Augustine, an early Christian theologian, actually had somebody say about this. He famously said, "You've created us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you." Yeah, I thought that was really good.
Yeah, that is the only place, man. And so my walk is considerably short, right? I encountered God in 2017. And at that point, I was like, the overwhelming satisfaction and peace in being in his presence was unreal. I had been for probably about a year in secret. My family didn't know about it. Most of my friends didn't know about it. Dealing with some stuff. I was dealing with some secret addictions. The devil had tempted me with my own gun multiple times. And I'd literally locked the door, buried myself. Most evenings I'd come home from the office, I'd work, and I'd just read the New Testament over and over and over. And at some point, something started to snap. I just remember like laying in my bed, and I'm just reading, and I would just be filled with like all of a sudden I'm just joyful.
Wow.
And I'm like, man, I haven't felt what is that? And all of a sudden I'm joyful, and then I'm like teary eyed. I'm like, what the heck is going on? Like something's happening here. And I would just be like, we're constantly striving for something. And there's a lack of, obviously just we're in a world full of evil, right? So we tend to look for it in other things.
Yeah.
A question we talked about earlier is, why and where do you think that there's so much skepticism against God in today's world, in today's society? And
I think that as humans, we're very complicated. One of the most frustrating things for me when I started diving into philosophy and apologetics and all of that is that even if something can be proved to be objectively true, a person can still choose to disbelieve it. Mm-hmm. And so for me, that was like, at first, I'm like, but how? Like, if it's actually true, like there's no, and by objectively true, I mean, like we're talking about the object and it doesn't care about what I think or what I believe. Like the sun is currently shining. It's objectively true, right? Yep. So that kind of, but people are so complicated. Like we're very emotional creatures. We have our own inclinations. We have our own autonomy. We get to make our own free choices. And so there's multiple variables that go into why a person lands where he believes, he or she. One of those could be sociological reasons or societal reasons. So there's pressure from the outside. Oftentimes, oftentimes when, a lawyer or a physician ends up, someone finds out that they're a Christian. In some cultures like ours, it's a little bit of a surprise. They're like, oh, I thought you were smart. And so there's a little bit of, and so there's also family dynamics. There's, there's church or mosque or synagogue or wherever, and there's all sorts of things. There's also hypocrisy within the church that sometimes happens that drives people to skepticism. And a very powerful one is suffering and evil. When someone experiences some sort of suffering, that could drive them away. I think at the bottom of it all, our culture here in the United States is shifting. I think it's shifting from we care about objective truth. It used to be, for me personally, it was a little bit more simple. I just debate the facts, and then people are either convinced or unconvinced. Now it seems like people are shifting away from objective truth and reality to what do I feel? What can Jesus do for me? And like, how do I experience my best life? And so people are growing to be more self-centered and more autonomous a little bit in the negative way in terms of like, how can whatever you're telling me serve me? And so I think when it comes to skepticism, it's a whole lot of things there. For me personally, I just didn't get good answers for a while. And I'm like, why do I need to invoke a creator where maybe there doesn't need to be one? And also, there's also the issues of autonomy and why do I need to impose someone else's morality on me where I can basically do what I want to do? And so all of that is kind of complicated. And so when I'm talking to a person, and every Christian, I think, when they're talking to a person, we should try to meet them where they're at and find out what's going on in their heart before we, jump in and try to, because I think Jesus has to be presented as the truth, with grace and truth. And it's okay if they're offended at the gospel and what Jesus said, but they shouldn't think we're jerks at the end of the conversation. But on top of Jesus being presented as the way, the truth, and the life, I think in our society and culture, Jesus also has to be shown as beautiful, because we're very, it's just the culture that we're a part of right now. We're kind of moving away from objective reality and objective facts to, self-centered subjectivity.
Yeah. Well, I think you also have the self-centered identifying with me. This is what I am now. This is what, as long as society says is okay.
Yeah.
And then not only do they say that's okay, society will try to justify it with science.
Yeah.
Right. Like this is a scientific thing. Like in today's current state, so much about the transgender and LGBT community that, we've gone away from the science was 20 years ago. You got man and woman. Now all of a sudden science has changed, and now it supports, transgenderism and so on.
Yeah.
And many will argue that it's incompatible, right? What are your thoughts on science and
I love this topic. Thinking
science
about
and God's
science
existence.
and religion. Science and God's existence. So the thing about science is science itself is neutral. Science is a tool. If you go to the dictionary definition, you will find that science is actually just a tool to examine the natural world. And so, which is what we live in. And so that's what it does. And if someone thinks that science and faith in God is incompatible, they either don't know what faith in God is or they don't know what science is. But they probably also don't know the history of science. Because if you throw a rock at any pioneer of modern science, we're talking Galileo, Kepler, Newton, if you throw a rock at Rene Descartes, like the father of methodic doubt in psychology, and 9 times out of 10, you will hit a committed Christian. Because science and the modern scientific revolution, the shoulders of the giants that we stand on today as we examine our world in the most modern place possible were Christians, at least theists. And so when you're saying that science and like when someone says that science and faith is incompatible, it's like, not according to history, not according to the people that founded science. And someone might push back and say, well, yeah, everyone back there was a Christian. That's not true. But beyond that, if you let them speak for themselves, they will tell you, I have quote after quote after quote, they will tell you why they were driven to discover these modern scientific discoveries. And it's almost always, they saw themselves as the priests of God. They saw themselves as worshiping to the glory of God by discovering the universe. It was their love for the Christian God that basically created what we today know as science. Yeah. And so science is neutral. And that's kind of my position. Science is a tool to help us discover the world. Science is a method, and then there's an idea. Yeah. And our ideas or ideologies are ways that we then, we can take science, we can take philosophy, we can take even art, we can take everything we can, put it together, and that's kind of our worldview. And the interesting thing about worldviews is everybody has one. Yep. Including atheists. Everyone has a way that they view the world. Yep. Yeah, so science just informs it. And that's all it does. Yeah.
When you were talking about it, because you talked about, or just a little bit earlier, is people's belief in whether it's to God or atheism is often determined by the evil of the world, right? Meaning like they're suffering or something that they've gone through. How do you define the existence of God and through the pain and the justice and going all through that? Because it's a common thing. Like you'll hear people were speaking about it, and you'll hear, well, where was God when I was molested? Where was God when my mom died when I was 2 years old and she had cancer? What's your
So with these kind of conversations, it's always very important before you jump into the philosophical answers, because there are good philosophical answers, to find out if the person needs the philosophical answer or they need someone to cry on their shoulder. Because if I jump in and I start just going at it,
which is I need to register it. That's actually a really valid point, because I think oftentimes when you're ministering to someone or you're answering a question, the very reality is that's just what they need, just to get it
Yeah.
off, and they need a shoulder to cry on and just someone to talk to, as opposed to hearing what your theological belief is.
Yeah, and this is something
And
I've
that actually opens the door to later on
That's good. Yeah.
to coming to that, to getting the revelation of the theological belief. But in the very moment, in order for that to open up, for it to break off,
They have to know that you care before caring what you have to say.
Yeah.
And the thing is, like, if I am, and this is something I had to learn, but if I am responding to somebody who is bringing up the problem of evil, and I am not coming from a position of love for them, I have no business talking to them about it. Because I'm not representing the gospel. I could actually be friendly firing my own team by even engaging. And so the thing is, like, we have to move out of a place of, Jesus was moved by compassion. And so, like, am I moved by compassion? Whether I'm talking to a person who's experienced suffering, I'm talking to someone from the LGBTQ community, I'm talking to someone who's just had an abortion. Like, am I coming from a place of compassion, or am I coming from a place of I'm right?
And condemnation.
Yeah, and condemnation. That's the thing also about our society right now, is like objective truth is objective truth. How am I getting there? Am I grace? Jesus came full of grace and truth. And so how do I model that? God could have yelled at us from a megaphone from heaven, but instead he took on human flesh and suffered alongside us. And so when it comes to evil and suffering in the world, I want to see if this is something I need to pray with them, cry with them, mourn with them, and walk with them through, and be an ambassador for the gospel that way before we get to the questions. But at the end of the day, there are good answers. And I think so this is something that's been written about for a very long time, like thousands of years. Think of the book of Job. The Psalms, one of the main themes in the entire Psalms, and the entire Psalter is, it's 5 books, and it's basically structured in a very interesting way. And there's this concept called Hesed. Hesed is a Hebrew word for basically God's unfailing love, and unfailing meaning like it's always here. And so throughout the book of Psalms, you have like this orientation in the first Psalm, where he's like, hey, blessed is the man who does X, Y, and Z. His life will be like this. Vines planted next to, he has all of the tree planted next to. And so he has all this. So he was orienting himself around what it means and what your life will look like. But then through the Psalms, you see all sorts of things. One of the Psalms ends with, and now darkness is my only friend, or my only friend is darkness. It's kind of like, I don't know for sure, but it's kind of like saying, like, God, right now, darkness is a better friend to me than you are. And so the Psalms are very, very provocative, and they're very honest with the suffering. But then somewhere around Psalm 73, I want to say, you have this pivoting Psalm where he realizes that actually God has an eternal perspective. And we don't know what the end is like for these evildoers that seem to be doing well now. And also he relies on the idea that actually God is with me. His Hesed is with me through this mess. And so the psalmist then becomes to more songs of praise. And Psalm 150 is all out just worship. He doesn't even give reasons at that point. He's just excited. And so I think that could also be applied to us. God has an eternal perspective. We can't. It was Timothy Keller, who recently died, philosopher and pastor from Presbyterian Church in New York City. He had this interesting point. He said, we can't have a God who is powerful enough to stop the suffering, so powerful that we can't even understand, to stop the suffering, while at the same time having that same God not having morally sufficient reasons for allowing it to continue that we don't understand either. We can't have it both ways. By the way, this applies to all suffering. There's called moral evil and natural evil. Moral evil is the stuff you see on the news. It's where someone pulls the trigger and kills somebody. It's when natural evil is more in terms with hurricanes, tornadoes, and things like that, or car accidents. And so with moral evil, I think the best response for moral evil is human free will, because I think overall it's better for God to create a world in which free humans are free to either choose him or not choose him, rather than create a world of automaton robots that have to choose him. Because I would argue that love is impossible without choice. And since God is love, he had to give us the freedom to say no. And so that is the God that we have. And my story was the same way. You want to wander away from me? Go ahead. I'm here. And I'm here to rescue you as soon as you're, and so I think the possibility of love is only possible if there is the possibility of moral evil. And the more people choose to not be with God and say no to God, the more evil they become. And so because all things that are good are from God, the closer we are to God, the less moral evil we're committing. And so in a world where there's free choice, there has to be moral evil. But I want to take this even deeper a little bit, if I may.
Go.
When you're talking about things like, I'm sticking on the moral evil side. When you're talking about things like that was evil or this was evil, where is the atheist getting their idea of evil from? Compared to what? And according to what? If there's such a thing as evil, that means the atheist has to say there's such a thing as good, right? Because where do you? But then how do you determine? And this is where ethics comes in. There's different systems of ethics. Don't have time to get into it today.
No,
but
go for it.
There's different systems of ethics in the middle that basically weigh good and evil. And like there's utilitarianism, which is basically like the most good for the most amount of people, which falls apart once you take it to its further conclusions. There's all sorts of them. But I think the best explanation is, because God is good, he is the standard. And so he is that moral law. He's that scale. And so if you're closer to God, you're on the good side. If you deny God's precepts, God's laws, and God's love, then you actually become more evil. And so it is only with some sort of moral scale that we can even have a word about evil. Because evil wouldn't exist if good didn't exist. And evil and good wouldn't be a real thing unless there was a scale. Does that make sense?
So with given that if there is evil, which we're talking about, there is, and good, what does that do to the atheist scale, to their belief?
So the atheist will have to come up with an ethical system that is not God. And in my experience, they don't hold very well. Okay, one of them, and this do we have time for?
Yeah, go.
One of them is there's all sorts of. Yeah, there's literally ethical egoism. It's something that is like, if it's good for me, that means it's good. But the one of them that was intriguing to me
that's an interesting term, ethical egoism.
Yeah. There's also so there's divine command theory. There's what the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, I think brought this up. It was I'm blanking on the name, but it's basically like, what does this next action do to my soul as a person? If it makes me a better person, then the action is good. If it makes me a worse person, the action is evil. And then there's something called utilitarianism, which is fascinating. I was debating an atheist one time at like a little thing that was going on, and I brought this up and I didn't get an answer, and I reminded everyone again, I think a month later when we got together, and still no good answers to this. So utilitarianism is basically, remember, we're talking about moral systems that help us to explain what evil is, right? Without God. Utilitarianism is the idea that if whatever we are doing causes the most amount of flourishing to the most amount of people, that means it's a good action. If it doesn't, it's a bad action. The question becomes then, what does flourishing mean? And what does good mean? Right? Because you're trying to prove that good exists. Yeah. So beyond that, though, it gets even worse. My question was, what happens? And back then, ISIS was a very big threat. And I'm like, in the Middle East. And I'm like, what happens if ISIS tomorrow converts 2/3 of the world's population, and they say, you know what, we're low on resources, the environment's failing, whatever, and we're gonna kill 1/3 of the earth in order to make it, better for everyone else. According to utilitarian methodology, you're causing the most amount of good for the most amount of people, especially if resources happen to be scarce. So does that make that action good or evil? And it's kind of, and then you without God as the ethical system, I've noticed personally, and I've studied ethical systems, nothing else really comes to a logical conclusion that you can hold against the Holocaust or abortion or whatever else. And so it
actually, as you were talking about, that's exactly what crossed my mind. Yeah. When you said, if I justify good, whether it's if ISIS did that, now it's climate change and aborting children. Right? Well, it's for the good of the world. So we've got to depopulate.
Exactly.
So now that's good.
Yeah. So that's what I'm getting at. There's like different ethical systems for good and evil on the free will side. So it's like moral good and evil, and so evil wouldn't exist if there wasn't some sort of scale, but also moral evil exists because free will is impossible. Love is impossible without free will. Yeah. But then there's the other side, which is the natural evil. And this side is a little bit harder. But I go to, I'm a little cautious bringing this up because I don't remember the immediate context, and context definitely matters. But somewhere in the New Testament, I think the Apostle Paul actually says that the earth is waiting, creation awaits with groanings for the revealing of the sons of God. I think that creation itself is broken. When God in Genesis says, I curse you to the earth, you will produce thorns and thistles. What happens with the earth when the earth is cursed because of sin? And so I'm wondering, and obviously there's also like sometimes an earthquake happens and people in cities realize that there are tons of building code violations that people just, again, moral evil. But I wonder if the earth itself is producing all this pestilence because of the brokenness of humanity in the beginning. And so we continue the cycle over and over again. And so eventually, I think when we have a new heavens and a new earth, none of that will exist, right? Yeah. There will be no more death, no more suffering. Yeah. So all of this, God, just to kind of sum up, God's perspective is beyond us. There's a perspective of eternity. If Christianity is true, if it's true, and this is not the only life we live, then one day he will be the one to wipe every tear from our eyes. And so when it comes to just like the subjective emotional response, it's like we have a God who took on human flesh, suffered alongside us, died on our behalf in order to reconcile us to himself so that we can one day live eternally with him in bliss. There is no other worldview anywhere. Comment section below if you know of it. There is no worldview that has that type of answer to the problem of evil and suffering. There isn't one. Not only do we have a God who intercedes for us, who died for us, who decided to take on human flesh in order to have the human experience and then suffer in order to reconcile us to himself. So you don't just have a God who has a different perspective higher than you that you can't understand. You have a God who's demonstrated his love for you in that. And so that's our hope. And so throughout all of history, the Christians have been the ones who've been alleviating suffering and evil on this earth more than anybody else. It's because we believe that we have a God who cares. Yeah.
It's so interesting you said that, because my one of my thoughts going into it is, a common conversation recently is that Christianity is a form of conditioning, right? Because we're talking so much about, like, right now you have conditioning is a pretty common word right now. Conditioning, or you're talking about what's going on in the schools right now. What's being taught to the kids, upbringings. To a degree, let's use the word brainwashing, right, for schools, right? Or what's being introduced, the sex ed curriculum. And conditioning has been a word that's been used as Christianity conditions people to believe them for what they want to believe in order for, like, that it brings them peace, right? Again, we go back to that thing, well, certain things will believe in people, certain people will believe in certain things that will bring them happiness or good or joy. But you actually broke it apart and defined it, because whether it's any belief system or religion or what you're putting your faith into, none of it is defined by the God that actually comes down, walks the earth as you and I did, experiences, sacrifices himself, is resurrected to be able to go through all those things for you to receive the forgiveness, for the redemption, everything that comes under the power of his word.
Yeah. That's true.
Yeah. So, you got so many different people that are looking for different subjects or different topics that they think will bring them peace, joy. But at the end of the day, it all comes down to the Creator, right? Again, we talked about that in that very first part of that's really what we're desiring. That's really what we're after. So,
that's good.
Kind of with skepticism being a little bit, I don't want to give it any more credit than it needs to. I don't want to say prevalent, but what do you think is a argumentative evidence for the reality of God? Yeah, because that's also, you have the Big Bang and you have all kind of scientific theories.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Big Bang was actually kind of not liked by some people that did not like the idea of God, because it basically proved that the universe has a beginning. Yeah. And so so there's a whole history behind that. If the universe has a beginning, that means it needs a beginner. Whereas before, people could believe that it doesn't need a beginning. Outside of Greek philosophy, there's Aristotle and the unmoved mover and the philosophical impossibility of a past eternal universe. So once this wandered into science and the Big Bang was proposed, some non-believers had a problem with it. But beyond that, I think that when it comes to evidence for the existence of God, I think we have to start at a level playing field, and we have to. And you mentioned conditioning earlier.
Yeah.
I have a 3-year-old who we try to pray with every night, and I'm very conscious of like, okay, the reason that we're doing this is not because I'm conditioning, but it's because this is actually true, you know. And so I think that we need to believe what's actually true, because conditioning happens for everybody, you know. And so when it comes to, you know, evidence for the existence of God, there's so much work that's already been done here. But ultimately, I think we need to start from a playing field of this is reality. This is what reality looks like as far as we can tell from science and philosophy and just observation and history. And what best explains reality? I think that's the fundamental question. And I think beyond everything, Christianity far exceeds to explain reality better than any other worldview, including atheism. And I think some of those arguments, and I'm not going to be able to lay them all out perfectly here, but some of those arguments have to do with the beginning of the universe. There's the Kalam cosmological argument, which is not my favorite, but it's the one that I go to, which is, I think, the easiest, which is basically everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. It relies on the Big Bang. Therefore, the universe has a cause. And so what is that cause? Well, if everything in the universe is space, time, and matter, Einstein's theory of general relativity basically showed that those things are co-relative, like they have to exist fundamentally, not apart from each other, space, time, and matter.
Yeah.
So if that's what the universe consists of, then whatever created the universe can't be space, time, and matter. So it has to be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, extraordinarily powerful, decisive or personal in order to make the decision to create. I mean, this is starting to sound very suspicious. And so as we keep going on this, and then you have the intelligent design movement, which there's been many debates among scientists, and they're basically like, in times of Darwin, he didn't know the complexity of human genetics. Like we're learning more and more and more about the complexity of creation. And so if there's a design, usually designs have designers, codes have coders. And so when you have complex coding, complex design, the specificities that are required to have us even have carbon in the universe, forget about life, carbon in the universe that actually somehow, you know, like all of this stuff, like where our planet is positioned from the sun, the moon being right there, the oxygen levels being just so, like all of these things, if they were off by a little bit, we'd be gone. And there's so many of these things. And so scientists have been looking at this, and some scientists, including Antony Flew, who died, but he was recently, not too recently, but recently alive, and he was a very respected scientist in the atheist community. Before he died, he wrote a book, There Is a God. And the atheists were like, something's wrong, like he's going crazy or something. But
I don't know if they were talking about the same guy. I just saw a quote about it the other day. There was a dude that had committed himself to proving that atheism is the way, like that was the answer. And like a year into it, he ended up getting converted to Christianity.
I don't know if that's the same guy, because that's actually it happens. But there's a few people that I know of, I think, like that. But and so there's like the way of looking at the world through the scientific lens and be like, what does science say about reality? And then going that way. There's also philosophical questions. What does science say about philosophy? What about psychology? What about that longing within us? And then eventually you get to what I think was the disciples' main argument for Christianity's truth, which is Jesus' historical resurrection. So there's been so much work done on this from a matter of strictly skeptical history. Just like we're not assuming the Bible. Like we're just looking. And I think it's beyond a reasonable doubt, not possible doubt. Nothing's beyond a possible doubt. In a court of law, reasonable doubt. Beyond a reasonable doubt that there is a person named Jesus of Nazareth who actually physically rose from the dead. And this would take me an hour to unpack, but there's thousands of pages written on this from credible historians and scholars. And so that, I think, was the nail in the coffin for me when it came to searching for different worldviews and religions. And I started from, is it even reasonable to believe in God, or do I have to throw my brain away? No, we're called to love God with our whole mind. And so basically what it started was there all the way down to world religions. And then historically speaking, man, Jesus rose from the dead. Like what he said is validated. And even more so, theologically speaking, what he did is validated, because it's a stamp of approval that our sins have been paid for. And so not only does it validate Christianity, but it validates us. So that's, I think Christianity, whether we're talking about morality and ethics, we're talking about, philosophy. We're talking about the worldviews of reality. We're talking about the science behind everything, whether it's intelligent design or just why are we here? Why is there something rather than nothing? All the way down to the historicity of the New Testament. I think, man, it's by far the best explanation for reality.
Yeah.
Best answers. Yeah.
Wow, that can go so many different ways as you're talking about it, because you can really take that, each one of those conversations, like the history of the credited scientists or these guys, the theologians you're talking about, and it can go so many different ways. And then you talk about Jesus himself. Tell me, for somebody that's watching as we wrap up, someone that's skeptical. It could be whether they're a past believer, maybe it was something that, just like you, they were desire to search for what it was specifically, right? And then you jumped through all the elements of disbelief, and then believing, and then dividing fact versus, you know what I mean, and drawing up those scales. In simple terms, define it from skepticism to the reality of Jesus Christ. For somebody that's like, you know what? I mean, I'll be honest. I have people I know personally that have been longtime believers for many, many, many years, and then had some sort of hurt in their life, and now all of a sudden they've pulled back. I am the church. I'm my own internal church. You know, Jesus was, we believe it, but I'm me now, right? So all forms of different skepticism to really bring it back to the Jesus we know the truth in.
Yeah, that's really good. When you're searching for God, the intellectual stuff is very fun for some of us. But I would say that if you're searching for a God who you think might be the type of God to respond, whoever she or he or they are, I think that prayer is important. And so if you're searching for God intellectually, keep doing it. I would say don't give up. If you encounter Christians who don't have the right answers or don't have satisfactory answers, that's fine. We're all learning, including you. And I think don't give up. Keep searching intellectually, because I think at the end of your skepticism, God is waiting for you, and you need to continue to dive deeper. And I commend that. But I think you also need to be very honest with this potential God. And I think it'd be good to make it a habit to ask him to reveal himself to you, and ask him out of a place of humbleness, and out of a place of submission, and out of a place of, if you're there, I'm ready to obey. I'm ready to follow, because it's the best news you could possibly discover. Yeah. And so that would be my encouragement for someone who's searching. Get into a community of people who, get into a community of believers, and ask them questions. And if they don't know the answers, go search them out somewhere else, and just keep going. Don't give up just because someone doesn't have the right answer. We're all people, and we will all disappoint you sometimes. And if there's hypocrisy in the church, that needs to be differentiated between hypocrisy in the church and Jesus. Yeah. If my math teacher comes into class one day and says 2 + 2 is 5, I'm not throwing math away. I'm throwing that teacher away because he misrepresented math. If someone misrepresents the gospel to you, don't throw the gospel away. Don't throw Jesus away. What did Jesus do besides love you and care for you and pursue you? Disqualify that person, sure, but don't throw away the gospel. That's what I would say. There's a difference between the message, the truth, the reality of existence, and what we are, what we do, where we are, the explanation for reality, and how people represent it. Yeah. So keep searching, but also accompany that search with prayer, because I really think God is waiting for you at the end. Yeah.
Dude, what a way to take it off.
Yeah.
Very well said. Before we do that, and we'll close out here in a minute, talk to me about prayer. Matter of fact, just this morning, I was leaving my house, and I think we tend to have prayers in our minds, but there's so much written about what leaves your mouth, right? Actually making that claim and being bold with it. Do you see a differentiation between having just an internal prayer, having internal conversations with your mind, or actually speaking it out loud? For it to resonate, for it to take place, for it to be heard. Because there's so much said, like you hear so much, like, there's the difference between, the word of God is placed above all, right? Yeah. And then how much is mentioned about us to be able to speak it, to be able to release it, to be able to pray it. The difference between just an internal prayer or an internal thought, right? Because sometimes it's like, oh, I prayed today. Was that a prayer, or did you think about it?
That's funny. I didn't think about that before. What did you think about? Yeah, I mean, Romans does tell us that he who believes in his heart and confesses with his mouth that that Jesus is Lord
Yep.
shall be saved. I think there is truth to that. Without getting too theological, personally, in my experience, I tend to be a person that internalizes things. Like when my wife told me she's pregnant, she already didn't expect a huge external response.
Yeah.
Because she knows I'm processing. And so for me, what's been very helpful is I started.
Did you just one of these guys, like she throws some big news on you and you're just like,
It takes me a few seconds, but like, oh, that's very cool. Like
super cool. The gears are grinding.
I mean, no, like inside I could be excited without like, expressing it all the time.
Yeah.
But basically for me, what was really helpful is being able to pray out loud. I think that a lot of times it's fine to pray in our minds. It's fine to even think. And sometimes, like as Protestants, we have a specific way that we pray. The Eastern traditions oftentimes have something called contemplative prayer, which is like Mother Teresa was asked, how do you pray? And when you pray to God, what do you say? And her answer was like, I don't say anything, I listen. They're like, what does God say? And she told them, God doesn't say anything, he listens. And if you don't understand that, I can't help you. If that quote if I'm remembering correctly. But basically, I think that there is truth to that. There's validity to praying something with your mouth out loud, not just because it helps center and focus you and makes what you say sound more official, I guess, to yourself, but also there's a spiritual world. Like we live in a spiritual world. And so there's powers and principalities, powers of the air. There's things that are around us that we're not seeing visibly, but it's good, I think, to say these things out loud so that we can remind them whose we are, and who we belong to, and what we're asking our Father. And so we're asking our Father in front of the people that hate him. Hey, here's what I would love. So it's very nice. Like it's very good. And for me personally, it's been a huge boost in my spiritual walk with God. Personally, I started doing this thing where I would go outside at night. It's been a little bit, I need to get back into it, but I go outside at night and I walk my neighborhood. And for me, like, because I internalize so much, it helps to do something physical while I pray. And so I get into a state where I'm walking, it's just me and the Lord, the moon and the stars are above. And I'm just asking the Spirit to show me, like, let's go through my day. Like, show me my day through your eyes. Like, where could I have done better? And then, and then I rely on his love and I ask for tomorrow. And it's come to a place where it opens me up to converse with God in a way that's not rushed. It's not in my mind, so I'm not getting lost. So
nor is it something that you're checking off, nor is it an obligation. It's
I look forward to it. Like I'm excited,
I enjoy that in the mornings.
Yeah,
I enjoy that in the mornings. Like this morning, I woke up. I was up at like 5:30. I was at the gym at 6, and then on my way back, it's just like that 25-minute stretch. I will purposely take the back roads because my gym is in Battleground. I will purposely take the back roads where it's nothing but fields and horses. And like in the morning, I'm still driving, and there's just fog rolling in over the hills. And I'm like,
see,
dude, I'm just talking out loud.
Yeah, there's something about nature as well. I mean, maybe it's just us, but I think it was Galileo, founder of modern science, who quoted Tertullian, who was a very early Christian theologian. And Tertullian said he believed that God is first known through nature, the book of nature, as some people call it. And secondly, and more particularly by his word, by his revealed word, which is the scripture. And so, yeah, man. And Paul, I think, echoed that. Or he echoed Paul in Romans 1. So I think it's really important to sometimes just get out there and understand that God, yes, my prayer closet is important. Never want to diminish that. But God is also important when I'm out and about in my life and when I'm in his creation,
Yep. True. Yeah. Absolutely true. Man, I really appreciate it. Dude, you dropped some.
This was fun.
This was fun. You dropped some gold, and I feel like just based off of some of the stuff we had, some of the things you touched on, we really could carry it on and make it a series. But this is good, right? Just to take apart, because a lot of skepticism, a lot of questions, a lot of doubts, a lot of again conditioning that's being pushed, being kind of encouraged, and I think it's great just to find breakthrough in the doubts, in the things that are being planted, and especially for the younger generation, man. I'm really hurting for them. I'm seeing just how much is being thrown at them, how much is being thrown at the family, at the division of the family, at the children themselves. Some of them they're so confused, they're so lost based off how much has been thrown in the last couple of years. It's like, dude, you got to peel the layers away, right? And present it in a way where you're like, listen, I want to be compassionate, and everybody is so offended and judged when you say, hey, like there's a way out of this. I'm not here to get you, but you should hear the good news. You should hear about this because listen, just knowing about that and leaving that seed in your mind is going to do some incredible things.
Yeah.
So it's good to do that. I think I'm confident maybe going down the road in the future, we'll do some more.
I'd love to.
It'd be fantastic. Really appreciate you coming
Thanks,
on,
bro.
man. It's been good. Look forward to the next one.
Thank you. Likewise.